All right, my friends, my name is Jonathan Page. I am the Director of Connectional Ministries for Innovation and Creativity, and I want to invite you to another episode of Before Conference Conversations. This is a podcast that goes through the different legislative committees that are going to be a part of the 2024 General Conference that is happening in Charlotte, North Carolina, April 23rd through May 3rd of 2024. And today we are going to talk about the legislative committee known as Church and Society 2. And so it is my pleasure to welcome our guests for today, which are the Virginia Conference members who are a part of that legislative committee. It's Reverend Dr. Robb Vaughn, and Mark Elder. How are you all doing?
Great, thank you.
Just geeking out for this.
Yeah, that's right. We're not too far away from General Conference now, and I know you all have been hard at work reviewing legislation in Church and Society too. So one of three committees related to the work of Church and Society. So as you've been reviewing petitions, what is it about Church and Society 2 that makes it unique? What's kind of the nature of the petitions that are coming up in your legislative committee?
Well, before we respond to that, it used to be that it would be one big, large church society, then it got divided up into A and B. So most general conferences, because it's such a huge hunk of stuff, dealing with all the social principles and everything everybody wants to change. So there were two. This year, because there's three, and there's a whole new revised social principles up. Right. So there's three dealing with all the stuff. So dividing up the work a little bit.
Sure.
One thing that I would say stands out, and it's what Rob just referenced, which is the revised social principles. There's been work done globally since 2016 to do a rewrite of our social principles, and that will have a lot of impact on our work in our committee, depending on how we choose to handle those revised social principles. I thought I'd let Rob maybe kind of build on that a little bit more.
Church society historically looks at our social principles, and folks, we've had these for since 1972. Right. Social principles are a critical part of how we witness to the world as well, and we've not revised them until now. So in 2012, the General Conference said, we want a whole rewrite. We want to do, and so from 2012 until 2020, the process for rewriting occurred. So we now have a set of revised social principles. They are globally sourced. If you read what we have now, they're often very United States centric. So we have writing teams from throughout the world. 52 individuals all over the globe did the first basic cut. 4,000 plus folks have reviewed these.
Wow.
You'll see it on, if you want to read them yourself, you can look at umcjustice.org. That's umcjustice.org. You can find 8 languages. Read them in your language of choice. It's a love letter to the church, offered from the General Board of Church and Society, which was tasked with shepherding this through. A lot of Virginia churches had the opportunity to be places where the social principles in draft form were looked at and revised. And so the revision is now before the General Conference, and the parts that deal essentially with our social order, predominantly issues of human sexuality, are what Church and Society 2 deals with.
Right. And that's it. And it's important to break down that there's kind of three main sections to the revised social principles. I believe it's and y'all correct me if I'm wrong, the social community, which is what y'all are dealing with, the political community, which is what I'm on Church and Society 3. We're going to talk about that in a podcast soon, and then the economic community.
And the creation care is going to be in Church Society 1.
That's exactly right. Exactly. So a lot of work around the revised social principles, and especially around it, like we said, that social community space. And a big part of the social community becomes the conversation about human sexuality, right? And so
it does. So it centers around things like family is one, about a statement on human sexuality, which is the other, a statement on marriage. And there's some new additions. So before I even go into those details, the marching orders were to do three things with the revision. One is to make them far more concise, so moving from about 76 petitions to about 52, to be more biblically and theologically oriented. So there's a beautiful preface in the beginning of each section that gives a really strong biblical theological orientation, and to be more globally relevant. So those were sort of the three components of the marching orders. And in Church Society 2, as in the other two, everything is around the whole agenda is looking at the new revisions and
Sure.
working through those revisions. The awkwardness is the petitions often that we receive are to change the old ones.
Oh, right.
And so
Sure.
there's a bunch of if you read through the ADCA, that's that book that has all the stuff that each committee works through. And I'm sure in other podcasts, folks have referenced the ADCA. You can
Of course.
download it if you can't sleep at night. It's a great way of getting your eyes tired. But it's also a way of looking at all the details of what each legislative committee looks like. So each legislative committee will essentially use the new revised social principles as the foundation of their work and probably either adopt it as a whole or work through that to essentially try to adopt it as it has been given. Sort of recognizing the beauty of the work of 4,000 plus folks from around the globe that have put this together as a love letter to the church.
Well, and there's some consequences if you edit that too heavily, right? Because all of a sudden it becomes no longer the document that was agreed upon that folks were able to work through together. You have something that's sort of a fragment of that.
And if you and I sat down together, we'd probably differ on how we would wordsmith particular things.
Sure.
But here we have an edited piece that has been worked at with folks from the Congo, from Denmark, from Mississippi, from Washington State, from Virginia, where folks have said this is not how all of us would prefer it, but together this is what we think is the best for the church at this moment in time.
Sure. I think that's helpful. So kind of as you're looking at that section of legislation, as you're looking at church and society too, legislation as a whole, are there pieces of that are kind of standing out, maybe petition? So for folks, if you haven't heard previous podcasts, legislation is organized by petition. And so you have a number of different petitions that all fall within a particular legislative committee. Any petitions that are kind of sticking out to you that seem like, hey, this is something we're going to really want to focus on?
I will just mention there's three large buckets of petitions for our committee. Human sexuality is one, but also marriage and reproductive rights. Those are probably the three areas. A couple of things that stand out to me is if we go down the traditional path and you just took the petitions themselves, standing on their own, there's petitions like on human sexuality that go in both directions, both to neutralize discriminatory language, but then also to make it even more discriminatory. So you've got that kind of stands out. If we go the route of looking at the revised social principles and use that as our chassis, as our vehicle for how we're going to work through the legislation, and we might get to a different outcome than we would if we took each of them individually. Another thing that stands out around reproductive rights is the fact that since those were written, we've had Roe v. Wade overturned in the United States. So it kind of changes context a little bit about whether or not the delegates at General Conference are going to be comfortable with where that language landed around reproductive rights, given what just happened in the United States.
And predominantly because the social principle in the revised social principles on reproductive rights is probably the closest to what the old language is than of any other part. Sure. So that was probably the least changed of anything. Often, in addition to all the dealing with revised social principles, we'll also be dealing with a ton of resolutions. So we may see the changes that have come in the last 5 years reflected in some of the resolutions. Resolutions are something that sunset and end every so many years. And so because of the awkwardness of this being the 2020 General Conference and 2024 and stuff that sunsetted 4 years ago and all this weirdness, there are a ton of resolutions that are up just for saying we need to keep these alive because they're important to the church. There are some where there's new information that has come forward. There are some in which there's new data. And then there's just brand new stuff. So, for example, there's petitions relating to artificial intelligence, which really wasn't the issue 5 years ago. Right. There's stuff relating to child soldiers, which is significantly more engaging now than before. So that's another part of the work of this legislative committee.
Do you get a sense? So we've had over 4 years now to sit with the 2020 legislation that's there, and a little bit more recently, we had an opportunity to receive Volume 3 of the ADCA. By the way, ADCA stands for Advanced Daily Christian Advocate, if we haven't heard that language before. So as you received that newer legislation that's just been proposed recently, did you see a lot of impact in kind of your committee based on that?
We do see some stuff that you would never think of before, like there's a petition in support of vaccination.
Wow.
That's actually a resolution
Yeah.
in support
Sure.
of vaccination. There's a bunch on abuse of older adults that has come forward. There is one on overcoming ableism. There are other areas. I mean, we've just chatted a little bit about some of the human sexuality elements, but there are other elements in resolutions, such as eradication of harassment, issues of sexual harassment in the UMC and society, one on putting children first. Sure. So there's a host of resolutions that are there unrelated to the social principles, but the ability of resolutions, they can kind of help be more time specific. Yeah. They run for a shorter period of time, and so we may, we'll be dealing with a lot more of them than usual because we're having to readopt so many that have essentially sunsetted, and there's new information on others.
Of course. So part of what we often will talk about on this podcast is a little bit about process. So we're still a few weeks away from General Conference, but we know the two of you are not the only delegates by any means on Church and Society too. Do you have a rough idea of how many people sit on your legislative committee?
In 2020, at that point, there were 65 tagged for that.
Okay, and so of that group, I'm imagining that you're meeting with some of those folks that are going to be delegates with you. Can you describe a little bit about what that sort of collaborative preparation process is like, and kind of what the nature of those conversations has been?
Sure, and yes, our committee has been meeting. However, I would qualify that by noting that only the United States delegates have been meeting so far, because we do not know yet. Our international delegates have not yet been assigned to committees, so we haven't gotten to know them, which kind of puts us a little bit in a bad place because we can't develop those relationships and kind of catch those delegates up to the work that we've done as delegates here in the United States. But that said,
And real quick, just to interrupt, because of when this podcast will air, just to note, we're recording this kind of in early to mid-February. So if it comes out a little bit later that those have been assigned, it's not that, we went back on something.
That makes a lot of sense.
Yeah,
and I would just note that despite COVID, I would just start by saying our committee has been doing due diligence to continue meeting throughout COVID. We were meeting regularly from 2019 into 2020, then COVID hit, and then we didn't suspend meeting altogether. We just didn't meet as frequently, but we did keep in contact with each other and having meetings together. Those ramped back up last fall. So we're at a stage now where we're meeting monthly, or even potentially even more often than monthly, as we start to think through strategy about how to tackle all the petitions and resolutions before the committee, and also deep dive a little further into the actual text of the legislation as well.
There are about 3 to 4 days of actual meeting time for a legislative committee, probably from Wednesday afternoon of General Conference, but the substance of from Thursday, Friday, and Saturday till your work's done on Saturday. So and you do a ton of stuff in those 3 days. Sure. And so developing relationships ahead of time is really essential. Being able to learn who other folks are, what their interests are, how they begin to conceptualize issues, what are the things we need to do some substantive conversation about, such as relationships with our Central Conference friends who we won't know, and hopefully we'll be able to gather a few meetings ahead of time. But that relationship building just makes it easier to work together when we see each other face to face.
Of course. And has some of that conversation and work led you to some prioritization within the legislation? I mean, clearly the revised social principles are a huge priority for CS2, but any other kind of prioritization work that you would be able to describe that's happened in that space?
I think you hit the nail on the head when you say the revised social principles. It's up there at the top priorities for the entire General Conference to consider those revised social principles. It might mean that a lot of other petitions and even some resolutions become less of a priority and may not even get addressed because there's really large issues before this particular General Conference that might, in a normal cycle, maybe that we would tackle all those petitions, but we just might not be able to get to the entire body of work that's before us.
I think we've found there's sort of agreements on sort of 3 general things for all of General Conference. One, regionalization is the most important, and then revised social principles, and then removal of harmful language. Revising of social principles and working on harmful language really are part of the areas of church society too. And in that, we've, I think, established some general tenets of how we're going to do the work. One, be sure that we spend some time in relationship building, that we need to listen to the concerns of all the folks, particularly catching up on folks who haven't been part of the process in earlier months, which is mostly our sisters and brothers from Central Conferences, mainly Philippines, Europe, and Africa, so that we spend time both knowing what it means in their context to deal with some of the issues that we'll be looking at and working on those relationships first, because you can't do anything better than the relationships you have. And then using the social principles of the framework, we'll probably then start working through that, whether we adopt them as a whole or we'll lift out one or two that we might say, these probably need more work for all of us, because while we agree on everything, there may be a few in which we really need some focus work. Things perhaps like definition of marriage, possibly a few others, but that's the one that comes to mind. And then how we work through providing that recommendation to the plenary session. And then we'll probably spend time with resolutions. So the work we've done so far is kind of establish what's the best sort of order of work that gets the most done and makes it the outcome a win-win for everybody in the church.
That's helpful. So I guess kind of as we're getting towards the end of our time together, I'm curious if, as you've been working through all of this, it's a lot of reading, a lot of discernment. Has there been anything that surprised you about kind of getting ready, and or maybe something you've read, or just is there anything that you've seen where you were either surprised or it's caused you to think in a different direction or anything like that?
Well, I'm a first-time delegate to General Conference, so for me, something that stands out definitely was the volume. This
Sure.
committee has a lot of volume, so to your point, there was a lot to read.
Do you know how many pages of legislation
I
is
don't
off
know
the
if I
top of
can
your head?
It's 1,500 in all three volumes.
Well, yeah, sure.
For the whole book, yeah.
Yeah.
But I remember I read all of that back in 2020, and then COVID hit, and then I put it all aside. But I have, in the last few months, I picked my book back up, went back to my notations, and tried to get myself back on track in terms of understanding. So just the volume was a surprise. And I didn't know, as a first-time delegate, that we would have a work group like we've had. Yeah. So that's new for me, and I happen to be on one that's been very active, like I said. So that's been really great to see, for me as a first-time delegate, to be able to participate in a very active committee group that really is taking this seriously. We're putting a lot of hours into getting ready.
Nice.
There's always been groups, affinity groups, collaborative groups, but probably more intentionality this time for being sure that all of the legislative committees are engaged in good collaborative work and good preparation work. I really feel I was in touch with one of my colleagues and friends from the DRC who had yet to receive their ADCA material. And I was thinking, and in our conversation, they note how often that it's late to kind of, I'm thinking, wow, that is so difficult it's tough to read it all ahead of time and consume it. And then if you're coming in late to the game, so trying to work as much as possible with friends who are outside the U.S. to be on board is really, really important. But I think there's such increased desire for collaboration this time. Unlike, while it's always been there, far more, I think, this time than I've seen before.
Another thing I might note, too, as we get closer, now we're starting to get more information. So even beyond just what's coming to us in our committee and the petitions that are in the Daily Advocate, we are also now getting emails and invitations to webinars from caucus and other affinity groups that in the church, other groups that have been studying this legislation, analyzing it, that are trying to influence the outcome. So that's adding like additional layers of analysis and information that goes along with the work we're doing in committee. So it's very much like, I'm sure, if you're a member of Congress sitting on committee, it's very similar. You have the legislation that's before you, but then you have all these outside groups and others who are trying to get information to you and influencing you, how you work through it. So that's becoming another resource as we get ready.
That's a generous word,
resource.
But it is an opportunity, right, to be able to hear those different perspectives and all of that. Well,
but we work on behalf of the church as and we encourage the prayers that folks have. I remember in past times how important they were, and notes that folks have written of encouragement, from prayer beads to all different ways of expressing, we're upholding you during this time. And that has really been quite meaningful.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think it goes without saying that we're so appreciative of all of us are delegates from Virginia, and throughout the Virginia Annual Conference, there are people who are praying for our delegation, who are praying for the work of General Conference, and that may be the best direct support that folks can be offering at this point. At least I would say. I don't know if do you all have a sense of other ways that folks can be supporting you in this time as you prepare and get ready to go to Charlotte?
Well, there are other opportunities. There are folks who, like I said, do like to analyze the legislation. That can be super helpful, because we're sitting on this one committee. At the same time, there's 12 other committees doing work. We can't be always on top of all the legislation across the entire General Conference. So that could be a way, too, if you enjoy that sort of thing, to read, be a person that analyzes, and that information is a way to help us connect the dots between how work we might be doing is related to work that's happening in the other committees. Prayers, definitely, we welcome the prayers and that type of support, too, as we go to General Conference.
Yeah, readers have been really helpful. Other folks who have read from other members of our delegation who are jurisdictional delegates, or even those who just want to help, who say, what can I do to help? And so we're kind of responsible for being sort of subject matter experts in the legislation we have responsibility for. But as Mark has said, there's like tons of others, and you just can't possibly know it all. So having others to kind of offer briefings on that, or insights, and hearing insights from a variety of perspectives is really helpful.
Absolutely.
And that's been a blessing that others have offered.
Yeah, I mean, I would testify that how I got connected with this work in the first place. I was a first-year pastor, and Denise Honeycutt asked me to be a reader for her at the 2012 General Conference, and that, having that's one of the blessings of that sort of shared space, is not only is it taking some of the burden off of those who are delegates, but it's also helping to equip people who might be delegates in the future, and getting them into that work. So I think that's a well-spoken word. Well, guys, we're really grateful. Oh, go ahead, Rob.
Well, I was just going to say, to kind of put a point on things, everything's important. Yeah. But I think in this particular cycle, issues of human sexuality have a different level of emotional impact and importance for the church. And Church Society 2 deals with two of those areas. Others are dispersed throughout. And regionalization is so important for the future of the church, to remove colonialism and to allow us to speak to our geopolitical context more appropriately. So it's a different kind of conference. And so thoughts and prayers are really significant this time.
Amen. Well, I'm really grateful to you all for coming on and for being able to share about the work of Church and Society 2. We are praying with you as you endeavor to Charlotte and as you endeavor upon this work. And I think I speak for the entire Virginia Annual Conference when I say thank you so much for your service and for being with us today.
Absolutely. Thank you.